The dim light of the city's street lamps cast long shadows across the precinct parking lot as the officer strode out, his boots crunching on the asphalt. He spotted the man leaning casually against a plain sedan, his hands in his pockets, his demeanor calm. It was a quiet night, or at least it had been, until this moment. The officer's steps quickened as he approached, his suspicion and disdain unmistakable. "Hey, you," the officer barked, his voice slicing through the cool night air. "What are you doing out here? You don't belong here." The man straightened, his face calm but unreadable. "I'm just waiting." "Is there a problem?" "Yeah, there's a problem," the officer snapped. "You don't get to loiter around here like you own the place. Show me some ID, now." The man raised an eyebrow, hesitating. "Is that really necessary?" Don't argue with me." The officer cut him off, stepping closer, his posture aggressive. "People like you don't get to question authority. Show me your ID before I put you in cuffs." The tension thickened as the man slowly reached into his pocket. But his calm seemed to fuel the officer's anger. "You're stalling. What, you think you're too good to follow orders? Hands on the car, now." "I think you're making a mistake," the man said, his voice measured, but the officer wasn't interested in listening. The officer shoved him against the vehicle, his voice rising. "You don't get to tell me what's a mistake, you understand? People like you are all the same, troublemakers, acting like the rules don't apply to you." The man flinched but didn't resist. His silence seemed to enrage the officer further. Without warning, the officer's fist collided with the man's jaw, the sound echoing in the empty lot. The man stumbled but caught himself, his expression still calm, almost eerily so, as though he wasn't surprised. "What's wrong?" the officer sneered, standing over him. "Got nothing to say now, huh? That's what I thought." The man straightened slowly, wiping the corner of his mouth. His gaze locked with the officer's, and for the first time, something flickered in his eyes, a quiet intensity, a depth that seemed out of place for someone who'd just been humiliated. "You don't know who I am, do you?" the man said quietly, his voice steady. The officer laughed, the sound sharp and derisive. "I don't care who you are. Out here, you're nobody." But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, his posture composed despite the tension radiating from his shoulders. "That might be the biggest mistake you've made tonight." The officer scoffed, already reaching for his cuffs. "The only mistake here is you thinking you're above the law." The man said nothing more. He didn't need to. Because the truth was about to crash down on the officer in a way he could never have anticipated. This wasn't just any man. This wasn't a random encounter. This was the very person who had the authority to turn the officer's life upside down. And in the quiet moments that followed, the realization would hit like a thunderclap, leaving the officer scrambling for answers, desperate to undo what couldn't be undone. But what happens next? How does justice unfold when the tables are turned? And what does it take to make someone face the consequences of their own prejudice? Stay with us, because this is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to stand with our Black audience and make it clear, Plow of Twist does not tolerate any form of racism or discrimination. We believe in equality, justice, and the power of every voice to make a difference. This story highlights the importance of accountability and the impact of standing up for what's right. Thank you for being here. We hope you enjoy this gripping narrative and, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more thought-provoking stories. Let's get started. The city hummed quietly at night, its towering buildings standing as silent witnesses to the stories unfolding in the streets below. In a neighborhood on the west side, life was defined by a mix of struggle and resilience. Here, under the worn-out glow of street lamps and the occasional rumble of a passing train, lived Marcus Bell, a man of quiet strength and unwavering determination. Marcus was the kind of person who walked into a room and commanded respect, not because of arrogance, but because of his calm confidence and the way he carried himself. At 6'2", with a lean but muscular build, his presence was impossible to ignore. His deep brown skin and short-cropped hair framed eyes that seemed to hold the weight of a lifetime of challenges and triumphs. Marcus had grown up in this city, in a small apartment above a bodega his family had run for decades. He had watched his father juggle 2 jobs to keep food on the table and his mother fight tirelessly for better opportunities for their community. Their sacrifices had shaped him, instilling a sense of purpose that drove his every decision. He'd always been a man who believed in justice, fairness, and the power of people to change their circumstances. It was why he had chosen his career in law enforcement, a path that came with its own challenges and complications. As the chief of police, Marcus had worked tirelessly to reform a system he knew was broken in many ways. He believed in the power of leadership by example, taking every opportunity to show his team that the badge wasn't a shield for abuse but a responsibility to protect and serve every member of the community equally. It wasn't an easy task. The weight of systemic problems, the skepticism of the people he served, and the resistance from some within his own ranks made every day a battle. But Marcus thrived on challenges. He didn't expect gratitude, he simply wanted to make a difference. On this particular night, Marcus was out of uniform, dressed in a simple black jacket and jeans. He often liked to move around the city unrecognized, blending in to observe the reality of the streets firsthand. It was part of his commitment to staying connected to the people he served. Tonight, he'd parked his car a few blocks away and was walking toward the precinct, his steps steady and deliberate. Meanwhile, on the other side of the precinct parking lot, Officer David Grant leaned against his squad car, scrolling through his phone. David was everything Marcus had worked to change in the department. In his late 30s, David was a career officer who had come into the force with preconceived notions about the people he served. His approach to policing was outdated and, frankly, dangerous. David saw himself as a tough enforcer, someone who believed in controlling, not serving. His tall, broad frame and piercing blue eyes often intimidated those he encountered, and he liked it that way. David had been reprimanded before for his aggressive tactics and inappropriate comments, but his superiors had always let him off with warnings, dismissing his behavior as passion for the job. This leniency had only fueled David's belief that he was untouchable, and over time, his arrogance had grown. Tonight, he was in a foul mood after an argument with his ex-wife over missed child support payments, and he was itching for someone to take it out on. The parking lot was quiet, save for the occasional hum of a distant car. Marcus arrived, walking toward his car parked at the far end of the lot. He barely glanced at David, but David noticed him immediately. Something about the way Marcus moved, his confidence and calm demeanor, triggered David's prejudices. To David, Marcus didn't look like someone who belonged in a police precinct parking lot at night. In David's mind, Marcus was a threat, a narrative he had crafted long before even exchanging words. "Hey!" David called out, his voice sharp. He straightened up, tucking his phone into his pocket as he approached. Marcus turned, his brow furrowing slightly, but he remained composed. "Yes." Marcus replied, his tone polite but firm. "What are you doing here?" David demanded, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "This is private property." Marcus tilted his head, confused but still calm. "I'm just passing through. Is there a problem?" David's eyes narrowed, and his tone grew harsher. "Yeah, there's a problem. I don't know who you think you are, but you don't belong here. Let's see some ID." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he reached into his pocket without protest. "I don't think that's necessary, officer." "Oh, really? You don't think the law applies to you?" David's voice rose, drawing closer. "People like you always think you're above the rules." "People like me?" Marcus asked, his voice low and measured, but there was an edge to it now. "You heard me," David snapped. "You want to keep talking back, or do you want to make this easy on yourself?" David was already reaching for his cuffs, his temper flaring. Marcus raised his hands slightly, stepping back instinctively, his calm demeanor unwavering despite the tension. "I think you're making a mistake," Marcus said, his voice steady. David scoffed. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can walk into a place like this without consequences." The confrontation escalated, but Marcus remained resolute. He could feel the weight of every injustice he had fought against bearing down in this moment. This wasn't just about him, it was about everything he had worked to change, and everything people like David continued to represent. And yet, Marcus said nothing more. He let the moment hang, knowing that sometimes silence could be more powerful than words. David, however, wasn't finished. As the tension reached its peak, he delivered a final blow, both verbal and physical, that would set the stage for a reckoning neither of them could have anticipated. What followed was an event that would unravel the lives of everyone involved and reveal truths that no one was prepared to face. The fluorescent lights in the precinct hallway buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the stark white walls. Marcus stood by the coffee machine in the break room, his jaw still faintly sore. He pressed a finger against it absent-mindedly as he stared at the dark liquid filling the paper cup. Around him, officers moved about, some chatting in low voices, others shuffling papers, oblivious to the storm brewing under the surface of their routines. The altercation in the parking lot hadn't been a passing incident for Marcus. He had spent years working to build bridges between the department and the community it served. That single encounter had threatened to unravel everything. Yet, Marcus hadn't confronted David Grant directly, not yet. He needed to be deliberate, careful. There was a greater lesson to be taught here, and Marcus wasn't going to let anger dictate his actions. He wasn't interested in petty revenge, he wanted accountability, a reckoning that would make an example of the very behavior he had fought to eradicate. But the tension didn't go unnoticed. Officer Rachel Torres, a young woman who had joined the force 2 years earlier, entered the room and paused when she saw Marcus. She was sharp, observant, and one of the few who truly respected Marcus's vision for reform. She frowned as she approached him. "Chief," she said softly, leaning against the counter. "You look tense. Everything okay?" Marcus hesitated, then glanced around the room. Lowering his voice, he replied, "Had a run-in with Grant last night. Let's just say he's as reckless as ever." Rachel's expression darkened. "What happened?" Marcus gave her a measured look. "Let's just say he made some assumptions. Assumptions he'll regret." Rachel's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't press further. She knew better than to challenge Marcus's sense of timing. Instead, she said, "He's been on edge lately. There's been talk. Some of the others are getting tired of covering for him." Marcus nodded, sipping his coffee. "Good. Let them talk. People like Grant thrive in silence. When no one speaks up, they keep pushing boundaries. But silence won't save him this time." Meanwhile, David Grant sat at his desk on the opposite end of the precinct, oblivious to the undercurrent of unease. He leaned back in his chair, flipping through his phone with a smirk. In his mind, the incident from the night before was just another routine interaction. He didn't see Marcus as anything other than an overconfident civilian who needed to be put in his place. The idea that he might have crossed a line never even occurred to him. Across from him, Officer Tom Hargrove, a grizzled veteran nearing retirement, gave him a disapproving glance. "You've been walking a fine line lately, Grant." David shrugged, his smirk unwavering. "What else is new? It's not like anyone's gonna do anything about it." Tom leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You're wrong. People are talking. Even the chief's been asking questions. You might want to watch yourself." David's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "The chief? What's he gonna do? The guys all talk. He doesn't have the guts to take me on." Tom shook his head and leaned back. "You're playing with fire, kid. Don't say I didn't warn you." The day dragged on, the tension in the precinct growing thicker with each passing hour. Marcus spent the afternoon in his office, reviewing reports and preparing for an upcoming community outreach event. He knew he couldn't let the incident with David overshadow the work he needed to do, but it was impossible to ignore the nagging feeling that this wasn't over. He had already started reviewing David's file, taking note of the repeated complaints and disciplinary actions that had been quietly swept under the rug. This time, there would be no sweeping. As the clock ticked closer to the end of the day, Marcus called a meeting with his senior staff. Rachel Torres was there, along with Lieutenant Paul Reynolds, a steady and reliable presence in the department. The mood in the room was serious as Marcus addressed them. "Let's talk about accountability," Marcus began, his voice calm but firm. "We've made progress in some areas, but there are still people in this department who think the rules don't apply to them. That changes now." Paul exchanged a glance with Rachel but said nothing. Marcus continued, "There's an officer under my command who crossed a line last night. And it's not the first time. I'm giving you both a heads up because what happens next is going to send a message. Not just to him, but to everyone who thinks this department is a playground for their personal biases." Rachel spoke up, her voice hesitant but steady. "Do you think people will support you, Chief? Grant has his allies." Marcus met her gaze. "I'm not looking for support. I'm looking for justice. And if some people can't handle that, they're welcome to find another line of work." Paul nodded slowly. "What's the plan?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "For now, we wait. But not for long." That evening, Marcus stayed late, poring over documents and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Outside his office, the precinct was quiet, the usual bustle replaced by an uneasy stillness. David Grant was still at his desk, oblivious to the storm that was brewing. Rachel passed by and paused at the sight of Marcus's light still on. She hesitated, then knocked lightly on the doorframe. "You should go home, Chief. It's been a long day." Marcus looked up and offered her a small smile. "Soon." But Rachel could see the wheels turning in his mind. Something big was coming, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it would change everything. As Marcus watched her leave, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't just preparing for a confrontation. He was preparing for a reckoning. And when it came, there would be no going back. The stage was set. The players were in position. All that remained was for the truth to come to light, and for justice to be served in a way that no one in the precinct would ever forget. The precinct was unusually quiet for a mid-morning, the kind of silence that made every sound seem amplified, the shuffle of papers, the distant hum of a coffee machine, the muffled voices of officers exchanging small talk. Marcus stepped out of his office, his expression calm, almost too calm. It was the kind of demeanor that made people uneasy, even if they couldn't pinpoint why. He walked down the hallway with a sense of purpose, his footsteps echoing faintly against the linoleum floors. As he passed the bullpen, conversations died down, heads turning to watch him. There was something about his presence today that demanded attention. Even those who didn't usually notice him couldn't help but feel the weight of his movements. David Grant was leaning back in his chair, scrolling through his phone as usual. He barely glanced up when Marcus entered the room, his focus more on the sports scores than the man who had just walked in. But then he noticed the shift in the atmosphere, the way people straightened in their seats, their gazes darting between him and Marcus. "Officer Grant," Marcus said, his voice even but carrying an undeniable edge. David looked up, his smirk faltering slightly. "Chief," he replied, forcing a casual tone. "Something I can do for you?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to an empty desk nearby and leaned against it, crossing his arms. His eyes locked onto David's, unblinking. "Let's talk," Marcus said finally. "In my office." David's brow furrowed, but he pushed himself up from his chair with an exaggerated sigh. "Sure, whatever you need." The room was silent as David followed Marcus out. As the two men disappeared into the hallway, the low murmur of speculation began among the officers left behind. Rachel Torres exchanged a glance with Paul Reynolds, both of them sensing that something big was about to happen. Inside Marcus's office, the tension was palpable. Marcus closed the door behind David and gestured for him to sit, but David remained standing, crossing his arms defiantly. "What's this about?" David asked, his tone bordering on dismissive. Marcus didn't sit either. Instead, he leaned against the desk, keeping his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp. "It's about last night," he said. "The parking lot." David shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You don't?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Let me refresh your memory. You accosted someone in the precinct parking lot. You demanded ID. You used language that was, let's just say, less than professional." David's expression darkened. "If this is about some random guy I questioned, I was doing my job." He looked suspicious. "Suspicious?" Marcus repeated, his tone calm but cutting. "Why? Because he didn't look like he belonged?" David didn't answer, his jaw tightening. Marcus straightened, stepping closer. "Let me be clear, Officer Grant," Marcus said, his voice dropping slightly. "The man you assaulted last night wasn't just anyone. He was me." For a moment, David froze, his brain struggling to catch up with what Marcus had just said. Then his face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "You?" he said, his voice rising. "You're joking." "Do I look like I'm joking?" Marcus's tone remained steady, but there was steel behind his words. "You didn't recognize me because I wasn't wearing a uniform. But that doesn't excuse what you did. You abused your authority, and you let your biases dictate your actions." David took a step back, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous." "I didn't, you did," Marcus cut him off. "And it's not just about me. This isn't the first time you've crossed a line, Grant. It's just the first time you did it to someone who could hold you accountable." David's eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out. "This is a setup," he muttered. "You're trying to ruin me." "No," Marcus said firmly. "You did that yourself. I'm just here to make sure it doesn't happen again." David's temper flared. "You don't know what it's like out there, Chief. You sit in this office, making policies, but you don't deal with the real danger. Guys like me, we're the ones keeping the streets safe." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. "Safe for who, Grant?" "Because it's not safe for the people you harass. It's not safe for the community you're supposed to protect." David opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus held up a hand. "This isn't up for debate. There's a disciplinary hearing scheduled for tomorrow. I suggest you prepare yourself." David stared at him, his face a mixture of disbelief and rage. "You're throwing me under the bus for doing my job." "No," Marcus said, his voice cold now. "I'm holding you accountable for failing to do it." David stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. Marcus let out a slow breath, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. The confrontation had been necessary, but it was far from over. Tomorrow's hearing would determine the full extent of David's consequences, and Marcus knew it wouldn't be easy. Back in the bullpen, David's outburst had drawn more attention. Rachel watched him stalk back to his desk, his face red with fury. She glanced at Paul, who gave her a small nod, as if to say, "It's happening." Later that evening, Marcus stayed late again, reviewing every detail of the case. He knew the hearing would be contentious, but he also knew it was a turning point, not just for David, but for the entire department. The silence of the precinct at night was broken only by the faint tapping of his keyboard. The weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him, but Marcus didn't waver. He had made a promise, to himself, to his community, and to the department he had worked so hard to reform. And he intended to keep it, no matter what it took. The next morning, the precinct was buzzing. News of the disciplinary hearing had spread like wildfire, and everyone had an opinion. Officers whispered in corners, speculating about the outcome. Some sided with Marcus, appreciating his commitment to reform. Others grumbled about loyalty and how the department should protect its own. The tension in the air was so thick it felt almost tangible. Marcus arrived early, his expression calm but focused. He moved through the halls with purpose, acknowledging nods from a few officers but not stopping to engage. Inside the hearing room, the setup was simple but formal. A long table dominated the space, with seats for the review board on one side and a single chair for the accused on the other. As people began to filter in, David Grant entered, his usual swagger noticeably subdued. He wore his uniform, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the room. When he saw Marcus already seated at the head of the table, his expression hardened. "Chief," David said curtly, taking his seat. Marcus didn't respond immediately, instead watching as the other members of the review board filed in. Lieutenant Paul Reynolds was among them, along with Captain Elaine Harris, a no-nonsense woman with decades of experience. The remaining members were representatives from the City Council and the Civilian Oversight Committee. When everyone was seated, Elaine cleared her throat and addressed the room. "This hearing is now in session. Officer David Grant, you are here to answer allegations of misconduct, including excessive use of force, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming of an officer. Do you understand the charges against you?" David shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. "I understand." "Good," Elaine said. "Chief Bell, as the complainant, you may begin." Marcus stood, his calm demeanor commanding attention. He looked directly at David as he began to speak. "This isn't just about what happened in the parking lot. It's about a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for too long. Officer Grant has been given multiple chances to correct his conduct, yet he continues to act in ways that undermine the integrity of this department." David's voice cut through the room, sharp and defensive. "I was doing my job. The streets are dangerous, and sometimes you have to make tough calls. If I hesitated every time someone looked at me funny, I wouldn't be standing here." Marcus's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained steady. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to intimidate and harm. The way you approached me that night wasn't about enforcing the law. It was about power, your power, and your belief that you could wield it however you pleased." David stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't know what it's like out there, Chief. You sit in your office, making policies, but you don't walk the streets like I do. You don't see the things I see." Marcus's voice rose slightly, cutting through David's rant. "I've walked those streets, Grant. I've seen the things you claim justify your actions. And I've done it without resorting to the kind of behavior that destroys trust and endangers lives." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. David's face flushed, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You don't get it," David muttered, his voice quieter now but no less angry. "People out there don't respect us. They don't listen. Sometimes you have to remind them who's in charge. And what do you think that achieves?" Marcus shot back. "Fear. Resentment. Distrust. That's not leadership. That's tyranny." Elaine raised a hand, her tone sharp. "Enough. Both of you." David sank back into his chair, his anger simmering just below the surface. Marcus took a deep breath, regaining his composure before continuing. "This department has to be better," he said, addressing the entire room now. "We can't afford to have officers who treat the people they're supposed to protect as enemies. We need accountability, transparency, and trust. And that starts with holding ourselves to the highest standards." Paul Reynolds leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Grant, do you acknowledge any fault in your actions?" David hesitated, his gaze darting around the room. Finally, he said, I was trying to do my job. If I crossed a line, it wasn't intentional. Marcus's lips tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Elaine, however, wasn't satisfied. That's not an answer, officer. Either you take responsibility for your actions, or you don't. David's jaw worked as he struggled to find the right words. I made a mistake, he admitted grudgingly. But I don't think this hearing is fair. I've done a lot for this department, and this is how I'm repaid. Marcus leaned forward, his voice quiet but intense. This isn't about repayment. It's about accountability. If you can't understand that, then you don't belong here. The room fell silent again, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. David looked down at his hands, his bravado finally crumbling under the pressure. Elaine spoke again, her tone decisive. The review board will now deliberate. We'll reconvene shortly with our decision. As the board members filed out, the room remained tense. Marcus stayed seated, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. David sat across from him, his shoulders slumped, his earlier defiance replaced by a sense of unease. You could have handled this differently, David said quietly, not meeting Marcus's eyes. Marcus looked up, his expression unreadable. So could you. With that, Marcus stood and left the room, leaving David alone with his thoughts. The wait for the board's decision was excruciating, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. When the board finally returned, the tension in the room reached its peak. Elaine cleared her throat, her expression grave. After careful consideration, the review board has reached a decision. Officer Grant, your actions were a clear violation of departmental policies and the trust placed in you by this community. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending further review. Additionally, a formal investigation into your past conduct will be initiated. David's face fell, his mouth opening as if to protest, but no words came out. The weight of the decision was undeniable. Marcus stood, his gaze steady. This isn't the end, Grant. You have a choice now. You can learn from this, or you can let it define you. But know this, the days of looking the other way are over. As Marcus walked out of the hearing room, the murmur of voices followed him. The precinct was changing, and while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, Marcus knew they were finally moving in the right direction. The air in the precinct felt heavier in the days following the hearing. The usual rhythm of the office had shifted, as if the building itself was adjusting to the weight of what had occurred. Officers moved through their routines cautiously, their conversations quieter, their glances more furtive. The fallout from David Grant's suspension rippled through the department, sparking debates in hushed tones at desks and in the break room. Marcus Bell carried the gravity of it all with his usual composure, but even he wasn't immune to the emotional toll. Sitting in his office, he stared at the stack of files on his desk, each one a reminder of the work still to be done. Despite the outcome of the hearing, Marcus knew this wasn't a victory to celebrate. It was a necessary step, but it had come with a cost, a fracture within the department that would take time to heal. Rachel Torres knocked lightly on the open door before stepping inside. She held a folder in her hand, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Chief," she said softly, setting the folder on his desk. "It's the preliminary report from Internal Affairs. They've already found a few red flags in Grant's past cases." Marcus nodded, opening the folder and scanning the contents. "It's what I expected," he said, his voice heavy. "This isn't just about him. It's about a culture that allowed this kind of behavior to thrive." Rachel hesitated before speaking again. "Some of the officers are uneasy. They think this might lead to a wider investigation." "It will," Marcus said firmly, looking up at her. "And it should. If there are others like Grant, we need to root them out. This department can't serve the community if it's not willing to hold itself accountable." Rachel nodded, her respect for Marcus evident in her gaze. "You know I'm with you, Chief. But not everyone feels the same way. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. Change always meets resistance. People are afraid of what it means for them. But fear isn't a reason to stop. The tension wasn't confined to the precinct. News of David Grant's suspension had reached the community, sparking a range of reactions. Some saw it as a long overdue acknowledgement of the problems within the department, a glimmer of hope for accountability. Others viewed it with skepticism, doubting whether it would lead to real change. Protests erupted outside the precinct, with signs demanding justice and reform. Marcus stepped outside during one of these demonstrations, his presence drawing a mix of cheers and wary glances. He approached a group of community leaders standing at the forefront, their faces a mix of frustration and cautious optimism. "We've heard promises before, Chief," one of them, an older man named Gerald, said. "What makes this time different?" Marcus met Gerald's gaze steadily. "Because we're not just promising change. We're making it happen. But it won't happen overnight. It takes time, and it takes all of us." A younger protester stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Time isn't enough. People are dying. Families are grieving. We can't wait for the system to fix itself." "You're right," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "That's why we're not waiting. Grant's suspension is just the beginning. There's an investigation underway, and we're going to take action based on what we find. But we need the community to be part of this process. If we don't work together, nothing will change." The young woman hesitated, her anger tempered by the sincerity in Marcus's tone. Gerald placed a hand on her shoulder, nodding at Marcus. "We'll hold you to that, Chief. You've got a lot of eyes on you now." Marcus nodded in return. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Back inside the precinct, Marcus convened a meeting with his senior staff. The room was tense, the weight of the moment evident on every face. Paul Reynolds was the first to speak, his voice measured. "We've got officers questioning whether this investigation is going to turn into a witch hunt." "It's not a witch hunt," Marcus said firmly. "It's about accountability. If they've done their jobs with integrity, they have nothing to worry about. But if they've abused their power, they should be worried." Elaine Harris leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "There's another concern. Morale is low. Officers are starting to feel like they're walking on eggshells." "They should be," Marcus said bluntly. "This isn't a time for complacency. It's a time for reflection. If this department can't stand up to scrutiny, then we've already failed." The room fell silent, the weight of Marcus's words settling over them. Rachel finally spoke, her voice steady. "What's the next step?" "We wait for the full report from Internal Affairs," Marcus said. "Once we have it, we'll take action. And we'll do it transparently. No more sweeping things under the rug." The days that followed were a test of patience and resolve. The investigation unearthed more than anyone had anticipated, patterns of misconduct, cases where evidence had been mishandled, complaints that had been ignored. Each revelation added another layer to the growing tension within the precinct. David Grant, still suspended, became a symbol of the department's reckoning. Some officers avoided him altogether, while others whispered words of support. He remained defiant, his anger simmering beneath the surface. One evening, as Marcus prepared to leave for the day, he found David waiting for him in the parking lot. The two men stood in the faint glow of the streetlights, the night air thick with unspoken tension. "What do you want, Grant?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. David took a step forward, his posture rigid. "I want to know why you're doing this." "Doing what?" Marcus asked. "Holding you accountable. Doing my job." "You're tearing this department apart," David said, his voice rising. "You think this makes you a hero? It makes you a traitor." Marcus's expression didn't waver. "A traitor to what? A culture of silence? A system that lets people like you abuse their power without consequences? If that's what I'm a traitor to, then I'm fine with that. David's face twisted with frustration. You don't understand what you're doing. This is bigger than you. Bigger than me. You're right, Marcus said, his voice calm but resolute. It is bigger than both of us. That's why it has to change. David shook his head, his hands clenched into fists. You think this will fix everything? It won't. You're just making enemies. Marcus stepped closer, his gaze steady. If standing up for what's right makes me enemies, so be it. I didn't take this job to make friends. I took it to make a difference. David didn't respond, his anger giving way to a flicker of doubt. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the weight of their choices hanging between them. As Marcus walked away, the tension in the parking lot lingered. The road ahead was far from clear, but one thing was certain, the fight for accountability was far from over, and the consequences of the department's reckoning were only beginning to unfold. The precinct was a pressure cooker, and every day felt like it might be the one where the lid finally blew off. Marcus sat in his office, the blinds drawn against the prying eyes of those who wanted to see whether he looked as composed as he sounded. The truth was, even he could feel the strain, a heaviness settling over him that no amount of coffee or late-night strategizing could shake. Outside his office, the hallways were alive with a muted buzz, officers and staff whispering in corners, their voices thick with speculation. Some spoke in hushed tones about the growing list of names tied to the internal affairs investigation. Others voiced frustration at what they called a witch hunt, a term that had gained traction among those resistant to change. Marcus was acutely aware of both sentiments, but he also knew that silence was no longer an option. Rachel Torres appeared in his doorway, her expression a mix of determination and weariness. She held a tablet in one hand, its screen glowing faintly with the latest updates from internal affairs. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. They've flagged 4 more cases, she said, placing the tablet on his desk. Misconduct, evidence tampering, excessive force. It's all starting to pile up. Marcus leaned forward, scrolling through the report. His jaw tightened as he read the details, each one a stark reminder of the systemic issues he was up against. How deep does this go? He muttered, more to himself than to Rachel. Deep, she replied, her voice quiet. And it's not just Grant. There's a pattern here, one that goes back years. Marcus sat back in his chair, his hands steepled in thought. This is bigger than I anticipated. If we act on this, it's going to shake the department to its core. Rachel nodded, her eyes meeting his. Maybe that's what needs to happen. Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock at the door. Paul Reynolds stepped inside, his expression grave. Chief, we've got a problem. Grant's been talking to some of the younger officers. Stirring things up. What kind of things? Marcus asked, his tone sharp. Paul sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. He's saying you're targeting people unfairly. That this investigation is a way for you to push your own agenda. Marcus let out a slow breath, his frustration evident. And they believe him? Some do, Paul admitted. Others are just scared. They don't know who's next, and it's making them paranoid. Rachel crossed her arms, her frustration bubbling to the surface. This isn't about targeting anyone. It's about holding people accountable. If they can't see that, then maybe they're part of the problem. Paul raised a hand to calm her. I'm not disagreeing with you, Torres. But you know as well as I do that fear makes people irrational. They're looking for someone to blame, and right now, that's the chief. Marcus stood, his gaze shifting between Rachel and Paul. Then it's time to address it head-on. Later that day, Marcus called a department-wide meeting. The briefing room was packed, officers standing shoulder to shoulder, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion. David Grant stood near the back, his arms crossed, his face a mask of defiance. Marcus took his place at the front of the room, his posture straight, his eyes scanning the crowd. The murmurs quieted as he began to speak. "I know there's been a lot of talk," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Rumors, accusations, fears. So let me set the record straight. This investigation isn't about targeting anyone. It's about ensuring that this department lives up to the oath we all took, to serve and protect, with integrity and honor." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Marcus pressed on. "I won't pretend this is easy. Change never is. But we can't afford to ignore the issues that have come to light. If we turn a blind eye, we're complicit. And I refuse to be complicit." David's voice rang out from the back of the room, cutting through the tense silence. "What about loyalty, Chief? Doesn't that matter? Or is throwing your own people under the bus your idea of leadership?" All eyes turned to Marcus, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. He met David's gaze, unflinching. "Loyalty isn't about protecting bad behavior," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "It's about holding each other to the highest standards. If you think loyalty means covering for misconduct, then you've misunderstood what it means to wear this badge." David scoffed, shaking his head. "Easy for you to say. You're the one holding the hammer. And you're the one who handed me the nails," Marcus shot back, his tone sharp. "This isn't about me versus you, Grant. It's about whether this department stands for justice or corruption. You chose where you stand. Now you have to live with the consequences." The room was silent, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded subtly, their expressions thoughtful. After the meeting, Marcus retreated to his office, the adrenaline from the confrontation still coursing through him. Rachel appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, her expression unreadable. "You handled that well," she said, stepping inside. Marcus let out a tired sigh, leaning back in his chair. "Did I? Or did I just throw gasoline on the fire?" Rachel smirked faintly. "Sometimes a fire needs to burn before you can rebuild." Her words hung in the air as Marcus considered the truth in them. The fight was far from over, and the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the department could emerge stronger on the other side of this reckoning. The night air was heavy, a humid stillness settling over the city as Marcus stepped out of the precinct. The dim glow of streetlights cast long shadows, and the distant hum of traffic served as a reminder that, outside these walls, the world continued moving forward. But inside the precinct, it felt as if time had frozen, the weight of the investigation and its repercussions pressing down on everyone. Marcus headed toward his car, his mind racing with everything that had unfolded. The department was a boiling pot, and while some officers had started to see the necessity of the changes being implemented, others were clinging to their old ways, their resistance growing more vocal. He knew that what they feared most wasn't accountability, it was the exposure of the rot they had either ignored or perpetuated. "Chief Bell." The voice stopped Marcus in his tracks. He turned to see David Grant leaning against a parked car, arms crossed, his face shadowed by the dim light. Marcus's instinct was to keep walking, to avoid another confrontation. But something in David's posture, less aggressive, almost uncertain, gave him pause. "What is it, Grant?" Marcus asked, his tone even but weary. David hesitated, his jaw tightening as he pushed off the car and took a step closer. "I don't get it," he said finally, his voice low. "I don't get why you're doing this. Why you're tearing everything apart." Marcus let out a slow breath, crossing his arms. "Tearing it apart? Or fixing what was already broken?" David shook his head, frustration evident in his expression. "You think you're fixing things? All you're doing is turning people against each other. The guys don't trust you anymore." "The ones who don't trust me," Marcus said calmly, "are the ones who have something to hide." "That's not fair," David snapped. "Not everyone who's angry is dirty. Some of us are just trying to do our jobs, and now we're walking on eggshells, wondering if we'll be next. Marcus's gaze hardened. If you've been doing your job with integrity, you have nothing to worry about. But if you've crossed the line, then yes, you should be worried. David threw up his hands, his voice rising. It's easy for you to say that from where you're sitting. You don't know what it's like to be out there every day, dealing with the people who spit on us, who hate us just for wearing the badge. I know exactly what it's like, Marcus said, his voice cutting through David's tirade. And that's why I know there's a better way to do it. You think the badge gives you the right to act above the law. It doesn't. It gives you the responsibility to uphold it. David stared at him, his chest rising and falling with the effort of holding back his anger. You think I wanted to end up like this? You think I wanted to be the bad guy? No one starts out wanting that, Marcus said, his tone softening slightly. But somewhere along the way, you made choices. You let your anger, your fear, your prejudice dictate how you treated people. And now you're facing the consequences. David looked away, his jaw working as he processed Marcus's words. For a moment, the tension between them hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. Why didn't you just fire me? David asked finally, his voice quieter now. Why go through all this? The hearings, the investigation, it feels personal. It's not personal, Marcus said, his gaze steady. It's about setting an example. About showing this department, and this community, that no one is above accountability. Not even me. David let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You're a real piece of work, you know that. Acting like you're some kind of saint. I'm not a saint, Marcus said firmly. I've made mistakes too. But the difference is, I own them. I learn from them. And I expect the same from every officer in this department. David didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. Finally, he turned and started to walk away, his shoulders slumped. Marcus watched him go, a mixture of frustration and pity twisting in his chest. He wanted to believe that David could change, that this reckoning could be the start of something better. But he also knew that not everyone was willing to confront their own demons. As Marcus drove home, his thoughts kept circling back to the department and the growing divide among the officers. He knew he was asking a lot from them, too much, maybe. But he also knew that the alternative was unacceptable. Change was never easy, and it was rarely painless. But it was necessary. The next morning, Marcus was greeted by an unusual sight as he entered the precinct. A group of community leaders stood in the lobby, their presence commanding attention. Gerald, the older man Marcus had spoken to during the protests, stepped forward to greet him. Chief Bell, Gerald said, his tone formal but not unfriendly. We need to talk. Marcus nodded, gesturing for them to follow him into the conference room. As they settled in, he could see the mix of emotions on their faces, hope, frustration, skepticism. What's on your mind? Marcus asked, taking a seat at the head of the table. Gerald leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. We've been watching what's happening here. The investigation, the hearings, it's a start. But it's not enough. Marcus raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? We need more transparency, Gerald said firmly. Community oversight. Civilian review boards. People need to know that when officers cross the line, they'll be held accountable, not just in secret hearings, but publicly. Marcus considered this, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. You're asking for a lot. We're asking for what's fair, another community leader interjected, her voice sharp. We've lived with this system for too long. If you want our trust, you need to meet us halfway. Marcus nodded slowly, his mind already working through the logistics. It won't be easy. There's going to be pushback, from the department, from the unions. Let them push back, Gerald said. Change doesn't happen without resistance. Marcus smiled faintly, the echo of Rachel's words from days earlier ringing in his ears. You're not wrong. As the meeting continued, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still daunting, but for the first time in weeks, he could see a path forward, one where the department and the community could work together to rebuild trust and accountability. By the end of the day, Marcus sat in his office, watching the sun set through the window. The precinct was quieter now, the earlier buzz replaced by the hum of paperwork and quiet conversations. He knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like they were heading in the right direction. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Rachel stepped inside, a small smile on her face. Long day. Marcus chuckled softly. Long week. Rachel handed him a stack of reports, her expression serious now. Internal Affairs is wrapping up their investigation. It's going to get messier before it gets better. Marcus nodded, setting the reports on his desk. We'll deal with it. One step at a time. Rachel hesitated before speaking again. For what it's worth, Chief, I think you're doing the right thing. Even if it doesn't feel like it right now. Marcus smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. Thanks, Rachel. That means a lot. As she left, Marcus leaned back in his chair, the weight of the day still pressing down on him. But for the first time, he allowed himself a moment of hope, a quiet belief that, despite the challenges, they were making progress. And that, in the end, it would all be worth it. The resolution to the turmoil unfolded gradually, like the city shaking off a long and relentless storm. The final report from Internal Affairs landed on Marcus Bell's desk late one evening, a weighty document filled with names, dates, and damning details. Marcus read through it with a heavy heart, each page underscoring just how deeply the issues ran. But within that heaviness was also clarity, a roadmap for what had to happen next. David Grant's suspension turned into a termination. The investigation confirmed years of misconduct, each case adding another layer to the narrative of a man who had let power and prejudice consume him. David's final act as a member of the department was to sit through a tense public meeting where the findings were shared with the community. Though he had once held on to defiance, by the time his name was read aloud, there was nothing left but a hollow stare. In the weeks that followed, David tried to fight back, appealing his dismissal, seeking allies among the officers still wary of Marcus's reforms. But his efforts fell flat. The evidence was irrefutable, and the tide within the department was slowly shifting. Isolated and disgraced, David eventually left the city, his career in law enforcement over. For Marcus, the fallout was both exhausting and affirming. The reforms he had envisioned for so long began to take root. A civilian review board was established, a group of community members granted oversight powers to ensure transparency and accountability. The partnership between the community and the department strengthened, though it was not without its growing pains. Marcus spent countless hours in meetings, bridging the gap between officers who felt under siege and residents who demanded justice. It was grueling work, but it was also the work he had always known was necessary. Rachel Torres, who had stood by Marcus through every difficult moment, emerged as a natural leader in this new era. Her ability to navigate the complexities of reform made her a vital ally, and her integrity earned her the respect of both her peers and the community. Marcus saw in her the future of the department, and it gave him hope. Paul Reynolds, ever the pragmatist, found himself re-energized by the changes. Though initially skeptical, he came to appreciate the clarity that came with Marcus's leadership. He became a steadying force among the senior staff, helping to smooth the transition for officers who struggled to adapt. For the community, the changes brought cautious optimism. Trust wasn't rebuilt overnight, but the actions taken by Marcus and his team were tangible steps in the right direction. Gerald, the elder statesman of the protest movement, became a key figure in facilitating dialogue between the community and the department. His collaboration with Marcus symbolized the new path forward, a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to justice. Months later, as the precinct settled into its new rhythm, Marcus found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. He stood in his office, looking out over the city as the sun dipped below the horizon. The weight he had carried for so long felt lighter now, though he knew the work was far from over. Rachel knocked on the doorframe, interrupting his thoughts. "Chief, you've got a visitor," she said with a small smile. Marcus turned to see Gerald standing in the doorway, holding a framed plaque. "What's this?" Marcus asked, stepping forward. Gerald handed him the plaque, his expression warm. "The community wanted to thank you, for not just hearing us, but for acting. It's not much, but it's a start." Marcus looked down at the plaque, his chest tightening as he read the inscription, "For leadership, integrity, and the courage to do what's right." "I don't know what to say," Marcus admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Say you'll keep going," Gerald said. "Because we're not done yet." Marcus smiled, his grip on the plaque tightening. "I will. We will." The precinct was far from perfect, but it was better. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt that the work they were doing truly mattered, not just to him, but to everyone it touched. As the camera fades to black, let's take a moment to reflect. This story is about more than one man or one department. It's about the power of accountability, the courage to confront injustice, and the resilience it takes to create real change. Marcus Bell's journey reminds us that change isn't easy or quick, but it is possible when people stand together and refuse to accept the status quo. What did this story make you feel? Did it inspire you? Anger you? Make you question what leadership and justice really mean? Share your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear them. And if you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more thought-provoking narratives. Together, let's continue to explore the complexities of humanity and the unexpected turns that define our lives. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.